I'll go ahead and call the April 1st Public Safety Committee to order. I don't have any jokes. I'm too tired to have any, so I'm sorry if there are other April Fool's jokes that some members of the public or the committee may have. The first order of business is the approval of the March 18th Public Safety Committee meetings. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
I move to approve those minutes.
So moved. Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The second and only docket item we have is Resolution 2023-73, the adoption of the Active Transportation Plan and accompanying Safe Streets for All plan. I believe at the March, perhaps it wasn't at the March 18th meeting, but at an earlier meeting of the Public Safety Committee, we went over, it looks like it was February 12th, we went over in detail both documents. And we had Toby from O'Toole, or from Tool Design, go through the plans and explain the process and kind of how we got to where we are. But there were a couple refinements that the administration wanted to make based upon feedback of the committee, feedback of the public. And since council only has one opportunity, to finalize this plan, we all thought on the committee it would be good to bring it back to see the final modified version, to ask questions about it. And in line with that, we got the updated plans. It is hard to tell what changed, so I asked Assistant Director Boss to highlight some of the changes so we can focus the committee's attention on some of the updates and the explanations, and also just have another chance at discussing what will be an important document for the city going forward. So without, unless anyone on the committee or any other council members have comments to start, I would throw it over to Assistant Director Boss to go through some of the changes that both plans have had since February 12th.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. There's been an awful lot of work, I think, put into this plan since that February 12th meeting. We've tracked and resolved over 30 recommended edits to the Active Transportation Plan and 5 edits to the Safe Streets for All plan. And so we feel like, I think at this point, the plan's in a good spot to move forward. And so what I have planned is really, I think you have the slides in front of you as well. So there were 22 minor edits. Those were like grammatical small things that we caught and fixed, the majority of them. I'd like to spend the majority of the time just walking through the 8 substantial recommendations that came out of the last review plan, which really kind of boiled down to 3 things. And so I'll just walk through these kind of in one by one here. So network recommendations that did not align with rationale, that was probably the largest recommendation that came back from both myself and Bike Lakewood had 2 of those. Those are 3 of the 8 comments. And so when I say that network recommendations do not align with the rationale, in the infrastructure projects, which I know the infrastructure is always like the biggest focus of any of these plans that come out of what are we going to build out of this. There are lots of programmatic recommendations that come out of this, but in terms of these recommendations, which would be the dotted lines out there in terms of new bike and really it is bike focused infrastructure in this regard. The second map that you have is the crossing and specific intersection recommendations, but the biggest this recommendation in terms of not aligning with the rationale for bike infrastructure specific to the high-risk network. If you recall the discussion of a high-risk network and that whole analysis that went into that, as well as the analysis over the level of stress for both bicyclists and then pedestrians. The pedestrian level of stress does relate to some of these routes, but it relates more to the crossing and intersections. But this was specific to the bicycle level of stress. And it does, it makes an awful lot of sense, and that's the way that you should design a plan, is that you look at the conditions now, you look at what your recommendations are in terms of that bicycle infrastructure, and you should be lowering the level of stress for users from current conditions to a level that's appropriate for those roadways. It's easy to say that, and I think you all are aware of the difficulties and the conditions that we have in a city like Lakewood, as dense as it is, and with the limited rights of way that we have, that in terms of going from current conditions to those kind of objective or perfect conditions, there's a lot of difficulties kind of in that space that we have to deal with. And it's not always right of way, it's cost, there's will involved in that. Are we going to, totally change how we design a specific corridor or whatever to accommodate improvements? There's a lot of factors that go into that. And so what we did from the last plan that you viewed to the new plan is, when you're looking at those recommendations, this map that you see in front of you, those are what we're calling the base recommendations. And those are what Tool came up with as part of this whole planning process for the last 18 months. Based on the feedback from stakeholders, what you see on page 65 is what we're calling, what they called long-term vision projects, is what I called objective recommendations. And that's that appropriate mitigation, or we're trying to get at that mitigation of level of stress down to that appropriate level. Those objective recommendations are those things captured in long-range vision projects on page 65. May not be, and I'll just use the word feasible, whether that's right or wrong at this point, they may not feasible at this point to do that for one reason or another. And so there were 4 routes on here: Lake Avenue, Clifton Boulevard, Detroit Avenue, and Madison Avenue, that we had lengthy discussions about the recommendations, what Tool came up with and what we discussed, and the direction that the stakeholders and others felt like we should go in terms of mitigating or lowering that level of stress. Lake Avenue was one. We just had that project in 2019. I think some of you, if not all of you, are aware of probably the lengthy debate that went into that project in terms of how we ended up with paint instead of a shared use path. And there's experiences in Cleveland with trying to implement a shared use path. And so you can see the difficulties in sometimes of trying to implement.
It was an improved sidewalk.
Improved sidewalk, there you go.
Something.
Even an improved sidewalk that didn't make it across the finish line. There are a lot of, that's what I'm talking about, those difficulties between existing conditions and the objective of what you're trying to get at. So we didn't want to just leave those objective recommendations and those thoughts from the stakeholders and other folks, we didn't want to leave those to the side and lose them. And so what we did is we captured them here in these long-term vision project recommendations, that they're in the plan. They warrant due consideration if we're ever going to look at Clifton or Lake again or whatever, that they're here, they're captured. Clifton was another good example of that, is that we had significant discussions with GCRTA in terms of making changes to the Clifton right-of-way. They weren't comfortable with the recommendations that Tool had, so we did not want to lose their support, and there was a lot of discussion amongst the stakeholders about Clifton Boulevard. Even though it is a state route, it's a state bike route, the level of stress on Clifton for the average bike user, is that something that we really want to expend an enormous amount of time and resources over when we have something like Lake directly to the north, Detroit, and potentially, as we identified, the trail option here is something to explore a little bit more further when there's so much other focus of transit and traffic on Clifton. And so we ended up taking Clifton out of the base recommendations. You don't even see it on this map that's in front of you, and we pushed it to that long-term vision to look at something down the road. If we ever look at Clifton again in terms of that right-of-way and maybe redesigning that, then we would look at a shared use path or separated bike lanes. And so that's captured here in the plan. Detroit's in there as well with a buffered bike lane.
Pardon me,
Madison,
Mr.
in
Chair.
terms of,
Just a quick clarifying question. First of all, thanks for the presentation. I'm not on the committee, but I keenly interested in this. The version we're looking at, is this the March 28 revisions, which is in the electronic docket? I just want to make sure I'm looking at the right version. Okay, and some people have, but not all members of council have the printed copies, but it's the March 28 revisions that Assistant Director Boss, you're speaking from. Okay, I just want to make sure.
Assistant Director Boss is basically going over the differences between what was presented on February 12th and what we have in front of us today.
Okay, thanks. And I was not able to participate in the February 12 because I was out of town on business travel, but I'm glad to be here today. Thanks.
Lucky you, get a second chance, yeah.
So that's, I would just highlight, Mr. Chair, that's one of the biggest changes that was made, was that delineation, that differentiation between base, which are the majority of the recommendations, and these objective long-term visions that we didn't want to lose, but we wanted to make sure that they were captured in there for those their major corridors in the city. The second piece that I'll talk to are just the kind of individual modifications within the base network recommendations. I already mentioned, so I'll go back to this slide. I mentioned the Clifton Boulevard based on our discussion with RTA and all those other conditions and considerations. We shifted the recommendation that Tool had put forward for Clifton, and we shifted that to the long term. One example, that Bunts, and we're considering this right now. We're working on the whole Bunts project, which is coming up here in the next couple of years. Based on that discussion, that consideration, we extended the shared use path plan south all the way to Lakewood Heights. On the version that you had in February only had a shared use path and a very limited portion of Bunts. And now we've expanded the scope of that consideration of a shared use path. Graber, based on your comments, Mr. Chair, we took a look at, and Tool took a look at that counterflow bike lane, and their feeling was that we were well within ODOT and all those considerations to include that as well. And so what you'll see in that map, it's a short portion. I think it's project number 8 on there, but that does, it just as we discussed in the stakeholder meetings, that Graber kind of cut through. If that's a way that we can figure that out, that is a more direct connection to the existing shared use path down into the valley. And so if we can figure that piece out, we wanted that recommendation captured in the plan as well. And then there were a number of crossing improvements. And so these are the baseline behind these improvements were, again, taking another look at prioritizing transit stop locations, school crossing locations, looking at curb extensions, flashing beacons, and raised crosswalks. And so Tool took a look at kind of prioritizing those, successful implementation of those. And this is on page 59 through 64. There's a lot of crossing, 70 intersections that we took a look at that were prioritized here. And so across those project IDs, you'll see, I think it's 3 examples of raised crosswalks. To consider raised crosswalks, there's a handful of curb extensions in relation to transit stops, and some 1 or 2 flashing beacons out there.
And Assistant Director, can you explain, the first iteration did not have any raised crosswalks. This one has 3, at least as a potential treatment. Could you explain why those 3 were chosen and why? Because I see curb extensions. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a traffic engineer, but I see curb extensions and raised crosswalks performing a similar function, although different, right? Different treatment. But just curious as to why the 3. It seems like they're all around elementary schools, but then also why they wouldn't be, they're not recommended elsewhere.
These were the 3. Frankly, Mr. Chair, these were the 3 locations that Tool felt that they would be the most successful in terms of putting out there, and they are all in relation to school crossings. Now, it's up to us to consider those. Not saying we can't consider in other locations, but that they were very deliberate about the word consider installation. And here, you're talking about a raised crossing, which we don't have an example in Lakewood to look at. And it's one of those things that kind of, it requires a lot more consideration when it's not like the raised crosswalk, I think that's in direct connection to Harrison and Birdtown. The one on Madison and Atkins. That would be a higher level of consideration, I guess, for me in discussing with safety forces and other people about the impacts of a raised crossing that goes across Madison Avenue, as opposed to like the one that's on like Thrush or somewhere that's a side, more residential street that I can't see just at face value a huge issue with in terms of it's very similar to the speed tables that we put out there. It's just in more direct relationship to an intersection.
Yeah, and I guess my point is that I agree, having a raised crosswalk across Madison is quite a treatment, and it would, I don't know, I would encourage that it's truck route, all those other things, right? Or a lot of heavy traffic. But I do think there are a lot of areas in between those two examples, right? That would maybe warrant at least it being considered as an option, particularly if this is a document we're going to live with for 10 years. And I appreciate the fact that it's consider, and I don't want perfect to be the enemy of the good, but I do think that you're starting to see in more really thoughtful, kind of pedestrian-friendly cities across the world have more raised crosswalks. And there's stormwater concerns, there's public safety concerns, there's plowing concerns. All those are legitimate. But I do think in a decade, we may be further along with kind of their universal acceptance. And that's where I'm glad they're in here. I would like to see it almost where it says anytime there's discussion of a curb extension, because I don't see any curb extensions into Detroit or into Madison or into Clifton. I see curb extensions on the streets that feed into those roads, right? Because we're not necking down the state routes, at least not that I've seen in this proposed plan. So that's where I would push us to be more forward-thinking in that sense, because I agree having one at Madison, but having one at where I go by every day, the joint between Ward 1 and Ward 2, across Delaware, across where Woodward goes, right, in front of Hayes. So not on Delaware as you go east to west, but as you go north-south on Woodward. So that to me seems like a more of a on-the-border case than, Madison. So I would just push for that. Yeah, Mr. Director.
Yeah, thanks. Just piggybacking on what the chair was saying, like, may have missed it. If I missed it, I apologize. But what are the downsides or the barriers to putting like raised crosswalks onto streets like Madison?
I don't have that off the top of my head. My concern would be that, a raised crosswalk as kind of in a contemporary design and thought input it's basically like a speed table.
Mm-hmm.
And so we just have to be very cautious with where you put that, where you put those down in terms of those main commercial corridors.
So like what would be the negative impact of, let's just say, speed table? We're not talking about putting a speed table at Madison. Mm-hmm. So if it acts kind of like a speed table, raised crosswalk, why wouldn't we put a speed table on Madison, on a commercial corridor?
We'd have to look through that with safety forces, what their response time and what their primary emergency routes are. That's one of the, I'm trying to think, the underlying pieces of our traffic calming policy is that we don't, at this point, intentionally put speed tables or you consider horizontal or vertical interventions on primary emergency routes.
Yeah, so my question, like what I'm kind of driving and I'm trying to figure out is this like an actual, not actual, I won't say that, a structural issue, or is it more of a political, public opinion issue, and what the balance is? Because if you're balancing public safety, right, and you're balancing, it's a response time versus preventing a need for a response time in terms of traffic safety and things like that. So so what I'm thinking out loud here, is, would it be fair to say that having raised crosswalks on commercial corridors is kind of a balancing test between two different aspects of public safety there, in terms of pedestrian safety versus potential response time issues?
Yeah, and that's, I would say that that's one consideration among many for something like a raised crosswalk. I mean, one of the issues that when we were working over the last couple of weeks on this is that, you know, there's physical space and geometry involved in a raised crosswalk as well. Just consider the number, the distance that of most of our crosswalks from the physical intersection as opposed to other communities in this area. There's just not a lot of room in our crosswalk. You know, a raised crosswalk typically to give you the appropriate approach and angles on both ends so that it's not super abrupt, that's kind of the design of them. It requires almost the same distance as a speed table. It's 14 feet. And just think about the majority of our intersections and crosswalks, especially in relation to Madison, Detroit, even the east-west crosswalks, and trying to fit that approach ramp without jutting into the commercial corridor itself before you hit that crosswalk. So, and that's an extreme example.
Right, but that extreme example could be desirable from some points of view, right? I mean, it is reality, but I mean, that could be the desired result, is really getting from point A to point B by vehicle, I'm not saying less desirable, but slower, especially in a dense community that we keep saying dense community, where there are people on top of each other, walking, biking, driving. You're giving, not saying deprioritizing cars, but you're kind of giving equal shrift. Is it short shrift or short shift? Is it shrift? Yeah. Well, I guess equal shrift then to other modes of transportation, even though you're starting to level the playing field, which has been unleveled for a long time. And I think that was just where I was going with my discussion, because one thing that I see a lot in these type of documents is also room for community input and for community engagement, community input. And we get into this debate on what is the role of being an elected official, or being the mayor, or being a city council person, people that are responsive to the community and are elected to make decisions. And then you see this often in terms of development or other aspects, when the county comes in and wants to do a roundabout or something like that. You have this community input, and you have a lot of veto points there from people who are not elected or not representative of the actual community or chosen to represent the community. And there has been studies and data and books out there, especially in the planning space, about how the no votes have more incentive to show up to these type of community engagement events. Although notwithstanding this one, we have yes votes that have been showing up consistently on this, but that's rare because just human behavior. If you don't like something, you don't want something, you're more likely to show up to complain about it. If you're agnostic and you're like, okay, you're not going to spend time on your Monday night to show up to a meeting. And if you're kind of like, yeah, I would like that, hope everybody makes the right choice and says yes too, you're also not likely to show up. So that's what always kind of gives me pause, is when I see a lot of community engagement portions. Not that it's not good to communicate, but the ultimate decision should be left to, the people that are the most responsive and have to face the voters and the residents when a decision is made. So that's more rhetorical.
Yeah, that we went from granular to
Yeah, I kind of
public policy in
up
general.
the pyramid there.
No, but I do think to Councilman Schechner's point, and on this particular resolution that's before us, you know, we are espousing our values in our plan, right? And that's where I wouldn't want us to limit ourselves. And you know, every place I see, I guess this is the one point I'm going to press you on, Assistant Director Boss, is that every place I see curb extensions, I could see an argument for and against a raised crosswalk. And I'm just wondering if there is a particular policy reason why there's a distinction between the two.
I don't have a specific policy reason for you. Raised crosswalks, as I understand, Mr. Chair, raised crosswalks are a newer feature within this space. Curb extensions are, in terms of design and implementation, I think are well understood. In terms of the impact, raised crosswalks, just, you know, for all of the reasons that you've all highlighted, raised crosswalks is kind of the next step or several steps down the road in terms of that direct interaction with vehicular traffic to mitigate their impacts on the, you know, pedestrians and bicycle use of the road. And it's just something that we have to approach extremely cautiously, just as we've done with traffic calming in the neighborhoods. And I think that's where the recommendations that are in the plan right now are kind of in concert with that cautious introduction of something new, like a raised crosswalk. And the focus is, as I can see, is directly tied to schools and kind of that level of pedestrian advocacy and promotion that we're also trying to push with this plan in terms of safe routes to schools and those things. And I just personally, I believe that's the most appropriate level and area with which to introduce something where you're taking a couple steps beyond what is kind of within the contemporary norm of pedestrian design. Schools are a great place to start things like that. And so I don't disagree with you, and I don't want to come across as like trying to push it, but I just, raised crosswalks are just one of those things that I don't think we have a firm understanding of all of the impacts and the considerations that have to go into, and so we have to be very cautious about where we say we're going to put them.
Well, and I appreciate, but, you know, we have, you know, a dozen schools in this community, and we have 3 proposed intersections with raised crosswalks. But we have 40 or 50 intersections with curb extensions that we're recommending. So we've totally thrown you off of your presentation, so I will stop after this, but and my colleagues might.
I won't, I probably.
But I would just push that it's a option, not that it is a, just like you even said that the language was very purposeful to say consider installation of curb extensions. Consider installation of curb extensions, parking restrictions at crosswalk approach and or raised crosswalks. So I just would not want this document to limit us, is all I'm saying. And as we go for funding, as you know, Director Buttigieg creates more small p progressive, you know, transportation policies, I think that there may be opportunities that I would not want us to leave on the table funding wise for these things. So that Councilman Schechner.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, no, just real quick. Again, being out Chair, and this is what I've always respected about the planning department and you, Mr. Boss, is like, very careful, very meticulous, careful, realistic. And I think in echoing what might be the concern and getting a little more direct to it is that, like, in this where things changed in this document and or things left out really about, look, we're trying to be realistic here, and I'm seeing this now where I stand today or where we stand today. This isn't feasible in the next whatever year, so we're going to deprioritize it. And I guess I'll make that a question. Was that kind of the thinking there in terms of any?
No, I mean, we took the recommendation from the councilman as part of the stakeholder meeting. We turned it over to the consultant that we hired to help us draft this plan, and those are the three locations that they came forward that would be, and their feeling and recommendation would be most successful for implementation of a raised crosswalk. So do I think that that's the only place that we could potentially put it? No, there's probably other locations directly connected to schools. But again, we're relying on their judgment as well in terms of drafting this plan and what locations would be the most successful for something as specific as that in terms of a physical modification to the roadway.
I guess what I'm having trouble with is just what does most successful mean? Like most likely to happen or most likely to achieve the desired result? Or is it, one more option, most likely to achieve the desired result with the least amount of negative impact?
I think that's the,
The latter?
you're always trying to achieve the most, well, if it's a balance, and that's what I should say, it's probably the latter. Because you would say that there are lots of strategies and methods that you can implement that would totally shut off car traffic, and it would be wonderful for pedestrians and bicyclists, but is it realistic? No, it's not. We live in a city of 50,000 people, and there are more cars than there are housing units in this city. And so that's just part of the realities that we all live with in Northeast Ohio. It's not Portland, Oregon. We don't have a robust, we have as robust as a transit network as they're able to support. Would I love more transit? I would. I think everybody would. But we live in the city that we do, and we have to kind of work within those characteristics. And so, and sometimes it does take an incremental approach to something new that's out there to introduce it in specific locations, see if it's successful, and then hopefully to grow something that is successful and is effective.
Councilperson Striebeck?
Thank you. First, I'd like to say thank you for extending the shared use path on Bunce Road. There was a question that I had today, why we would just do that one section from Detroit to Madison as a shared use and not extend it all the way down to Lakewood Heights Boulevard. And then I also would ask a follow-up to that statement and why we wouldn't extend it also from Detroit down to Clifton, especially when we're thinking about redoing Merle Bunce Park there at the corner, that perhaps that would be a nice terminus point there for an entire path. Because the other thing I wanted to ask you, and it may be I'm misunderstanding some terminology, but I just wanted some clarification. On the high-risk network, those are the major thoroughfares in our city. Is that right? Where we're seeing like your Detroit, your Madison, your Clifton boulevards. And then the bike boulevards are where we're just sharing the road. Is that right?
That's correct.
Thank you. And why we would ever have shared bike boulevards in these high-risk networks, could you give me an explanation of when that would be appropriate? Because it seems to me if we are already aware that these are high-risk networks, high-risk roads, if you will, that to ask cyclists to share those roads, that doesn't make any sense to me.
Usually, the reason why something like a shared use path wouldn't be extended north from Detroit is based on a limited right-of-way. And I think that's, I might be mistaken, but I think that's the case there at Bunce with the right-of-way next down. Significantly, as you come Detroit, you go down the hill towards the Giant Eagle parking lot. The space for a shared use path or the implementation of a shared use path in that area, there may be other considerations that just made it not feasible compared to the right-of-way and the sizable tree lawns that are available from Detroit down to Lakewood Heights. And that's not saying that it's easy to install a shared use path as well. There's utilities, there's trees, there's residents, there's all kinds of other things that you have to consider, and utilities being probably the number one thing in terms of having to move utilities is not cheap. But that would be my, I think from what I recall of Bunce. But there are other things that you can do with a bike boulevard And Bunce is one that's different, and it's still 25 miles an hour. I understand that current conditions may not be what we would want them to be for a bike boulevard. But I think there's traffic calming, there's other things that we're integrating with and looking at the Merle Bunce Park project with pedestrian crossings and other things to try to mitigate some of that, just the free flow of traffic that you see now between Detroit and Clifton. It's a great area that you could take a look at curb extensions and kind of neck that road down at Merle, which I would think it would dramatically change the flow of traffic based on what's the current condition now, where you basically have that second lane, parking lane on the east side of Bunce, that you could retain that, but you could basically neck it down with a curb extension right there at Merle, that would kind of take it away as a second lane for people when there aren't people parked on there. That's just one example of how you could neck that down. But that's predominantly if there's not the right of way there, and it takes a significant amount of right of way to integrate an 8 to 10 foot shared use path. That's probably the reason why it wasn't extended to the north.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Councilman.
One other question as well. And then, I'm sorry, I was working off of the old draft, but I'm sure this is probably a similar in this new draft, about the cultural change strategies, and specifically for the office of the mayor to be put on hold until 2026 to start talking about expectations and priorities. And are we handcuffing our own mayor to not be able to start talking to people about just basically slowing down? And I'm just wondering why that's bumped out so far to ask our mayor to not start working on that now.
Which page is that on? I'm sorry.
What was the old one? And the old one was page 40. It's under the cultural change strategies. And I'm just wondering if there are processes in place that's prohibiting moving forward on just starting communication with our residents.
That's in the Safe Streets for All plan.
Yes, I'm sorry, Safe Streets Action, or Safety Action Plan. I had the chance to witness the mayor's safety presentation last week, and I thought it was excellent, other than the part where the police department were showing their own people crossing at the Hawk crossing, and cars flying right through that while they were videotaping when the lights are red. So I know that the mayor also has safety as our safety director as her first priority, and I'm just hoping that we can start having these cultural conversations sooner than later.
If I could chime in, I don't think this plan is taking into consideration all of these ongoing projects. Nothing in this plan is going to prohibit me from speaking about safety in our community. I think it's just based on timelines and getting projects done and infrastructure. It was identified that's a good time to start this comprehensive awareness campaign. But again, it's not stopping us from talking about it, as I did at the safety meeting last week. We have with our new public information officer, we have a campaign this month about distracted driving. So again, it's just taking into consideration this plan and when things are beginning to be implemented.
Thank you, Mayor George. Yeah, so the start date of 2026 was a little concerning.
No, I'm sorry. I just had to get the context of your question in terms of, so under the cultural change strategies, focusing on prioritizing safety for all road users, why we're not starting that until 2026?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I don't know if that is because the short term were all 25 and 26.
Yeah, there's some 24s in there, too.
Certainly willing to bump that one up to 24.
Yeah, Dave, I
That's
think
what
you
want.
may have been talking as a sidebar. I think I answered
Yeah,
that, I think
Sorry.
satisfactory, hopefully.
we will do that. I'll make
Okay.
that change to 24.
Thank you.
Councilman Bullock, I believe, or do you have any more, Councilman? or
No,
Councilman
thank
Stewart?
you.
No? Okay, Councilman Bullock.
Thanks. I have some general comments or comments across the plan, which is very wonderful discussion here. Do you want to get back to the directors or the assistant director's presentation or not? I mean, I could hold until,
Yes, let's let him finish his presentation. And then we also have one public commenter that would like to speak as well. So this is all out of love, Assistant Director Boss.
No, yeah.
keen interest up here.
I apologize for those dates. We spent an awful lot of time going through the strategies, like the themes and the strategies. I think a lot of those dates were, as in the section before that, whether it was ongoing, short-term, medium-term, long-term, a lot of those dates were, and I hate to use like not auto-populated, but I think they were put in there. We can certainly make changes to those as it's appropriate or makes sense. The final thing that I would just highlight was we had one program recommendation that was highlighted, and they wanted to, SIFLA, Bike Lakewood, we support that wholeheartedly, wanted to see an increase in enforcement on people who impede bike infrastructure. When you're getting ready to have like bike lanes on Hilliard, bike lanes on Lake, I think they've been noticing, it's just anytime you're in and around commercial, residential, everyone knows parking's a premium here in Lakewood. And so the enforcement of that and keeping that bike infrastructure clear is critical. And so they wanted that highlighted, and we certainly concurred with that, and Tool included that in the plan. Those, to recap, those are the three huge, the big areas that those 8 substantial comments for the active transportation plan all fell into. Predominantly network recommendations and shifting those things to get those right in the plan, and then the one programmatic recommendation. The Safe Streets for All, I will add your revision as 6 total recommended edits now. From the 5, they were all minor, just tweaks. There wasn't a huge sea change or recommended direction in any of those. And I will highlight the Safe Streets for All plan itself really kind of wrote on the back of the AT plan. It is designed specifically to be eligible or make us eligible for that federal level of funding. So it's a very valuable plan to have, but it basically carries forward much of what's in the AT plan and just puts it into the specific strategies and those formats that are required for either programmatic funding or implementation of infrastructure projects. So Mr. Chair, that's really that's the summary of the revisions that are there, and I appreciate the time.
Thank you. And then, Councilman Bullock, I do want to be mindful, there's one public commenter, but
Go ahead, yeah.
we still have
Let's
6.
have the public comment.
You okay? Mr. Van Leer, I would like to come speak. You can come give your name and address. We know you, but for the record.
There we go. Ben Van Leer, 1469 Woodward Avenue. I'm a member of Bike Lakewood, and I'm on the board of Bike Lakewood. So I've commented before about this plan. I participated in the stakeholder meetings. So thanks to Assistant Director Boss for the overview of the updates and for making the updates. Some of those were our comments, as you mentioned, from Bike Lakewood. And specifically for the base versus objective recommendations. That was, I think, that was my main comment at the end of the ATP stakeholder meetings, and the thing that, at least for the bicycle infrastructure, that was most important to me. And so I'll continue to press just a little bit, just to give you my as a project manager, or if you give someone the outline for a project and you set the expectations for that project at a base level, that's what you're going to get. You're not going to get any more than that. And so that's why I was pressing for the best implementation that's possible on each project, on each street, to meet the true vision of the active transportation plan, which I think is a really good vision. I'm going to read the 2 sentences to you now because I think that's the important part, which is that Lakewood envisions a complete and connected network for people walking and biking that provides year-round access to local amenities, resources, and the regional bicycle and pedestrian network. Lakewood envisions a culture of respect for all roadway users and bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure that's safe and comfortable for people of all ages and people with disabilities. And that's, to achieve that vision, it's that higher level than the base infrastructure that's needed. And so with a plan that has base and objective, if it were my plan, I would take out the base and leave the objective as the high standard that we expect for public safety and to achieve the vision of the plan. And I would ask, as we evaluate projects, let's say we're looking at a project on Franklin, that we not start with the base level, that we start with the goal of the project as the objective level each time we're looking at a project, to give that due consideration, and maybe some of the elements of it, buy their way off for whatever reason, cost, right-of-way limitations, things like that, but that we start with the best implementation that's safe for all users. That's my main comment. I just wanted to mention I support the comments on raised sidewalks. I know less about that, but I think the other thing that is also in the plan but could be made use of for things like that are pilot projects. I live on Woodward, where we have chicanes. The city boldly tried those out, kind of came to the conclusion that these speed bumps, speed tables are a easier, more affordable, and also kind of better user experience for achieving the same result. But we tried out the chicanes, and I think trying out pilots of high-level infrastructure would be a good way to start there. So that's all.
Thank you, Mr. Van Laer, for your comment, for your participation in the task force. Appreciate it.
Mr. Chair, I got a quick follow-up for the resident.
Yes.
Thanks, Ben, for coming to speak. So I appreciate your comments about kind of this as a management tool as well. So in other words, if you set a course, then all of the consultants and the funding, fundraisers who are pursuing grant funds, and the engineers and everybody else is going to align around what that course is. So I think there's some wisdom in the management and implementation side of this. And your experience comes from which organization and what project you manage? Because I happen to know you a little bit outside of City Hall.
I work in project management on the NASA Orion spacecraft, so working with the European Space Agency in the implementation of their spacecraft module.
So pretty complex, multi-partner, important project, and so we appreciate the fact that this is classic Lakewood, right? We've got all these really talented residents to draw upon, and so I don't know what your billable hour rate is, but I'm sure it's not being fully charged to the active transportation planning citizen group, so we appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Nope, but I'm also a public employee too, so.
Super. Yeah, well, that's true too. So, Mr. Chair, thanks for this. So I think that, Mr. Boss, the high level of engagement here is a compliment. I mean, there's a lot of interest in this plan and this topic. And thank you, Mayor George, and to the George administration for devoting more than a year, probably closer to 2 years on this now. That gets us these interesting and thoughtful plans. I've got some feedback. First, I want to compliment strongly a couple of elements here. I noticed the maintenance, planning, and coordination and timelines section of the active transportation plan is thorough. It's, first of all, it's included as a core portion of the plan at all, and that thoughtfulness is going to serve us well in the future, because we don't want to just build it once and forget about it. And in fact, we get seasonal stuff in the curb lane all the time on the Franklin bike lanes, and that requires maintenance and thought. So I appreciate that here. Same compliment for the ongoing monitoring and evaluation. It's another great point that we've got to do this successfully, not at a moment in time, but for a sustained period of time, and then intelligently adapt and improve. I applaud a couple of other things. I think this is in the Safe Streets for All plan. It says, establish a permanent and dedicated funding source for action plan implementation. That's also huge. Rather than safety corrections being an afterthought, if we create the financial capacity because it's a priority, because we don't want kids getting hit walking to and from school, which I heard from the superintendent at a board meeting recently, there were 4 so far this year and counting, and I was horrified that that was the case. So we should double check those current statistics, but it should be 0, of course, and that is in our plan to have Vision Zero. Our adopted plan says that over time we want to have a traffic design and safety enforcement that hit 0. So establishing a permanent and dedicated funding source is a great element, and it also then adds ensure staff are trained to implement the action plan, because that also is not automatic. So I really appreciate the thoughtfulness that the team that's worked together on this effort is putting in those areas. I join my colleagues in wanting to spend some time making sure the details are right and that this plan is as ambitious as we can make it. There's a balance between achievable and ambitious, but I think our community wants us to stretch a little bit, not just kind of stay safely within what's achievable. And we're not Portland today, but could this plan help us become Portland in a feasible manner over time? It would be my response to that. So a couple of examples of that, what I mean. So I appreciate in the intersection treatments, we have a significant number that say consider installation for curb extensions. And then also in a few spots also of consider raised crosswalks. My question, and I know this has been discussed a little bit, is what exactly does consider mean? Because if consider means in practice, yeah, we had it on our list, but we're not going to do it on a routine basis. We're mostly not going to do it. That is less of what I would like to see compared to saying in a fair number of these cases, we are going to get to yes and have the actual road conditions with these new techniques, kind of like the chicanes and the speed tables, and then get some real world experience, and then branch out some more. So there's a lot of discretionary room. So I'd love to hear what that means in the real world. What does consider mean? The other thing is, my metrics for success of the active transportation plan would be that the interested and concerned bicyclists really start to have, that we see that mode shift, that they're out there more frequently, and that means we need the higher quality bicycle facilities. And we have some of that. It's exciting to see the Bunce Avenue and Riverside, and I think I jogged that Graber. I'm pioneering that Graber connection already on my feet. But
I'm doing that since middle school. But yeah,
you've been doing that your whole life, right? So that there, there's some elements in here, but maybe what I haven't seen on this very slide, the first bullet under 8 substantial all incorporated / resolved says network recommendations do not align with rationale. I think that's what Mr. Van Leer was talking about. I'm looking on page 65. I'm not sure I see where it's called out that we have language to address this base versus objective split. I'd love to understand that. To summarize, I think maybe if we can say this plan's a floor but not a ceiling, that would add a lot of comfort to me that we're not committing for the next 10 years to only do as much as is called out in this plan, but to say, instead, we've got a thoughtful plan that does a good job of getting the city coordinated with other agencies in the city within our different departments, talking to each other, being comprehensive, being systematic. It's great to see how we've tiered Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. So there's a lot of good analysis here. But I haven't been involved in all 77 intersections or 30-some other improvements, and I don't think we can do that tonight or even next time we meet. So is there some language where we could agree that if over time we'd like to do more than what this plan says, that that's envisioned in a part of what we're saying here? And perhaps that could be a simple sentence or small paragraph that we incorporate if it's not already in here.
Yeah, thank you, Councilman Bullock. And I do want to be mindful, we have our regular meeting starting in 4 minutes, and I do want to make sure we're mindful of the public's time as well. What I would say is I would pose to the committee that we have a brief meeting before the next council meeting on April 14th or 15th, whatever date that is. I don't think anything's scheduled right now. Just to wrap up some of these last comments, because I know, I appreciate Assistant Director Ross going through all this effort, and like I said, this is from a place of interest and care and thankfulness for what you do. But I would like to dive a little bit more into the raised crosswalk issue. Potentially, I call you, we can talk about it a little bit more. But then we could then seek for full approval at the April 15th meeting or the 14th meeting, if that's amenable to folks. I don't want to leave this with some pending issues, I guess is what I'm saying. So I'll turn to Assistant Director Boss. Are there timelines that would frustrate if we approved it on the 14th or the 15th? Even though you've lived with this thing for 2 years, so I'm sure you'd rather just get it done.
Off the top of my head, I don't have an impending deadline that would impede. But yeah, we would need some more discussion on, especially the raised crosswalks issues in terms of where you would want to see them. I certainly can scrub back through here, just as we did with Tool, to look at maybe the school locations.
Yeah, I'm happy to give you a bulleted bulleted list of what I think they should be, and then we can have a call and talk about it, maybe another committee member, just so we don't have a public meeting. But I don't want to signal to the public that we're not enthused about this plan. I just want to make sure we get it right before we pass it. And I hope that most of your work is done, Director Boss.
It's done. I would just caution you that consider is a double-edged sword. So while it provides you flexibility in implementation, it also doesn't guarantee or promise the implementation of specific recommendations that someone out there might be looking for. And so I would just caution you that it works both ways.
It's a planner's conundrum. Yeah.
So because there are a lot more than just the people in the dais who are looking for this plan and what's in this plan.
Was there a motion to strike, consider, and replace with shall?
Well,
I mean,
I don't think we can even do that.
Yeah,
but
right.
But so I'll go ahead and make a motion to defer this action item and then try to schedule it before our next council meeting. Is there a second on that motion?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
With no other business coming before this committee, I'll go ahead and adjourn.